What if the most dangerous role some Hollywood stars ever played was never filmed? Behind the glamour of the golden era were actors who quietly entered intelligence services, worked with resistance networks, reported information to governments, helped deceive enemy forces, or became part of wartime propaganda operations. Some famous spy stories are exaggerated, but others are astonishingly real. If you enjoy forgotten Hollywood stories where the truth is even stranger than the movies, subscribe to the channel. Number 1. Cary Grant. Few men looked more comfortable under pressure than Cary Grant. That calm, polished image later made him perfect for Alfred Hitchcock thrillers, but during the early 1940s, his social connections also attracted attention from government authorities. Grant moved among wealthy Americans, British expatriates, politicians, studio figures, and people whose political sympathies mattered at a time when officials feared Axis influence inside the United States. Biographical accounts say Grant quietly passed information to American authorities about people in his social world. Later retellings upgraded the story into a full secret agent career, and even claimed that he helped expose fellow actor Errol Flynn as a German agent. That last accusation remains highly disputed and should not be treated as established fact. What appears more credible is that Grant acted as a useful confidential contact, because his fame opened doors. People spoke freely around him. He could attend dinners and parties without seeming like an investigator. Hollywood saw a charming leading man. Government officials saw someone who could hear things they could not easily hear themselves. Number 2. Marlene Dietrich. The woman who had become one of Hollywood's most glamorous imports made a decision that placed her directly against the regime ruling the country of her birth. Marlene Dietrich rejected Nazi attempts to lure her back to Germany, became an American citizen, and devoted enormous energy to the Allied cause. Her work eventually brought her into the Office of Strategic Services, the American wartime organization that later became famous as a predecessor of the CIA. Dietrich participated in morale operations, where music and carefully designed broadcasts were used as psychological weapons. German-language recordings could reach enemy soldiers and undermine the certainty that official propaganda tried to maintain. She also traveled close to military areas to entertain Allied troops, often under uncomfortable and dangerous conditions. This was not the glamorous version of espionage Hollywood would later sell. Dietrich was not stealing a briefcase from a locked embassy. Her weapon was credibility, language, emotion, and a voice German soldiers already recognized. The screen siren had discovered that celebrity itself could become an instrument of war. Before we continue, subscribe if you enjoy real stories hiding behind classic Hollywood legends. And share the video with another old movie fan who thinks the stars only lived exciting lives on screen. Number 3. Josephine Baker. A glamorous performer could enter rooms that would immediately reject an obvious intelligence officer, and Josephine Baker understood that advantage better than almost anyone. Famous throughout France and internationally celebrated, Baker moved among diplomats, officials, wealthy patrons, and military figures while maintaining the appearance of a celebrity simply living her public life. During the Second World War, she worked for French intelligence and later supported the resistance and Free French cause. Information gathered at social events could be passed onward, while her fame made travel easier than it would have been for an unknown courier. Accounts of her wartime service describe messages being concealed among papers and musical material, using the ordinary belongings of a performer as cover. Her story sounds like a movie because the basic facts were genuinely dramatic. She used celebrity access, language skills, nerve, and mobility to help France while occupation spread across Europe. Baker did not merely perform for history. For several crucial years, she quietly participated in it. Number 4. Sterling Hayden. Hollywood had already decided Sterling Hayden looked like a star, but Hayden himself was not satisfied with spending the war protected by a studio contract. He left the film world, joined the American military, and eventually entered the Office of Strategic Services under the name John Hamilton. The false name was not a publicity gimmick. Hayden became involved in genuine clandestine operations in the Mediterranean and Balkans. His seafaring experience made him useful, and his OSS work brought him into contact with resistance forces fighting Axis occupation. He helped with supply operations and worked in dangerous territory where failure could not be corrected with another take. After the war, Hayden returned to Hollywood and eventually appeared in classics such as The Asphalt Jungle, The Killing, and Dr. Strangelove. Yet the hardest character he ever played may have been the identity he carried during wartime service. Unlike many celebrity spy stories, Hayden's intelligence career is not a rumor created by fans. It is part of the documented history of the OSS. Number 5. Henry Fonda. At the height of his fame, Henry Fonda could easily have remained in Hollywood making patriotic films. Instead, he volunteered for the United States Navy because he reportedly did not want to spend the war merely pretending to fight on a movie set. His service eventually led him into air combat intelligence in the Pacific. That role involved the collection, organization, and interpretation of information required by commanders and aircrews. Intelligence officers helped build the picture of enemy strength, positions, tactics, and operational conditions before missions were launched. Fonda, therefore, was not a civilian undercover agent working under a false identity. He was a uniformed naval officer performing real intelligence duties during active wartime operations. His service earned him the Bronze Star. Afterward, he returned to acting with the same quiet authority audiences already knew. Movies such as Mr. Roberts would later place him back inside military settings, but the man on screen was no longer imagining everything from a script. He had already served inside the real machinery of wartime intelligence. Number 6. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Hollywood royalty did not keep Douglas Fairbanks Jr. safely behind studio gates. During the Second World War, he entered the United States Navy and became fascinated by British commando methods, especially the idea that small, specialized forces could make an enemy believe something much larger was happening. That interest helped create the beach jumpers, naval units designed to deceive enemy defenders. Using boats, radio traffic, smoke, sound, and other signals, they could imitate the presence of a major amphibious assault. Enemy troops might shift attention toward a false landing, while the real operation developed somewhere else. Fairbanks later commanded a beach jumper unit during Operation Dragoon in southern France. The concept had an unmistakably theatrical quality. Create a convincing performance, control what the audience sees, and make them react to an illusion. Yet the audience in this case was hostile military intelligence, and the consequences were real. A man raised in motion pictures had become part of a wartime system that used carefully staged deception as a weapon. Number 7. Christopher Lee. Decades before audiences knew him as Dracula, Saruman, or one of cinema's most intimidating villains, Christopher Lee had already spent years inside wartime service, where secrecy was ordinary. Stories about that period later grew so extreme that separating fact from legend became almost as difficult as following one of his movie plots. Lee served in the Royal Air Force and worked in RAF intelligence during the Second World War. His duties took him through North Africa and Italy, placing him inside the military information structure supporting Allied air operations. Later internet stories claimed he had been an SAS commando, a professional assassin, or a participant in almost unbelievable covert missions. Those claims go beyond what available records securely establish. Lee himself often remained deliberately vague when people pushed him for sensational details, which only encouraged the mythology. The verified truth is already impressive. Before becoming famous for playing men who seemed to know dangerous secrets, Lee had actually worked in a wartime environment where certain information really could not be discussed. Number 8. David Niven. The elegant gentleman audiences knew from romantic comedies and adventure films made an unusually direct choice when Britain entered the war. David Niven left Hollywood and returned home to serve. His military path eventually brought him to the GHQ Liaison Regiment, better known as Phantom. This secretive formation operated close to fast-moving battle areas, gathering and transmitting information about positions, movements, and changing battlefield conditions. Commanders needed reliable reports quickly, and Phantom teams helped provide them. Niven also became connected with commandos, wartime film work, and deception activities. His later memoirs sometimes mixed fact with amusing storytelling, so individual anecdotes should be handled carefully. The Phantom connection itself, however, is documented. That makes Niven's screen image wonderfully misleading. Hollywood presented him as a man who could survive danger with a raised eyebrow and a perfect dinner jacket. During the war, his charm was temporarily replaced by a uniform and a job in a secret reconnaissance and communications organization where accurate information could influence entire operations. Number 9. Anthony Quayle. Some actors later played secret officers because they looked convincing in uniform. Anthony Quayle had already lived inside a genuine clandestine organization before his screen career reached international audiences. During the Second World War, he served with Britain's Special Operations Executive. Before that, he had been involved with auxiliary units, the secret stay-behind organization created in case German forces invaded Britain. The idea was grim. Selected personnel would disappear into hidden bases and continue resistance from behind enemy lines. Quayle later served as an SOE liaison officer with partisan forces in Albania. The mission placed him inside a complicated world of occupation, local political rivalries, difficult terrain, shifting alliances, and constant uncertainty. Years later, he appeared in films such as The Guns of Navarone and Lawrence of Arabia, playing men surrounded by military tension and secret plans. Audiences saw an actor performing authority. What they could not see was the memory of a younger Quayle working with one of Britain's most famous covert organizations when the danger was entirely real. Number 10. Ronald Reagan. Long before Ronald Reagan entered the White House, his name was already appearing in confidential government records because of the political battles taking place inside Hollywood. During the late 1940s, Reagan was president of the Screen Actors Guild and became deeply involved in disputes over suspected communist influence in the film industry. FBI records and later historical reporting identify him as a confidential source who supplied information to federal investigators. That relationship did not turn Reagan into a trench-coated field agent. He did not break into offices or cross borders under a false passport. His role was closer to that of an informant, a well-connected Hollywood figure who could tell investigators what he was seeing and hearing inside an industry they were closely monitoring. The period remains controversial because legitimate concerns about Soviet espionage existed alongside accusations that damaged careers and encouraged political fear. Reagan's relationship with the FBI therefore belongs to that complicated history. Hollywood knew him as a leading man and union president. Federal investigators knew him as someone willing to talk privately. Number 11. Basil Rathbone. Long before a deerstalker cap and pipe made him cinema's most famous Sherlock Holmes, Basil Rathbone had already learned what it meant to search for information where a mistake could cost lives. His intelligence experience belonged to the First World War, years before Hollywood turned his sharp face and precise voice into symbols of calculation. Rathbone served in the British Army with the Liverpool Scottish and became an intelligence officer. His work included dangerous reconnaissance close to enemy positions. One of the best-known stories from his service describes him using camouflage and daylight patrols to observe German lines, reasoning that an unexpected approach could sometimes be safer than following predictable routines under darkness. He received the Military Cross for his wartime service. The experience came at a terrible personal cost as well. His younger brother John was killed during the war, a loss Rathbone carried long after the fighting ended. Hollywood later seemed almost determined to cast him as men who noticed everything. As Sherlock Holmes, he could walk into a room, study a few objects, and understand the entire crime before anybody else. In Swashbucklers, he became the elegant villain, calculating his opponent's next move. Those performances were fiction, but the discipline behind them had a real-life echo. Rathbone had once been responsible for observing enemy territory, interpreting what he saw, and bringing information back to men whose decisions depended upon it. Number 12. Noel Coward. Noel Coward built his reputation on sophistication. He seemed permanently surrounded by witty conversation, fashionable people, expensive rooms, and the kind of international social circles where everyone knew everyone else. During the Second World War, that public identity became useful to British intelligence. Coward traveled widely and used his fame to meet influential Americans at a time when Britain desperately wanted the United States to support the Allied cause. He could attend dinners, speak with politicians, meet journalists, and move among wealthy figures without attracting the same suspicion that would follow an obvious government emissary. Archival accounts describe him working on behalf of British intelligence while also participating in propaganda. Because the work was secret, Coward could not publicly explain why he spent so much time abroad while Britain was under attack. That secrecy even exposed him to criticism at home from people who assumed the famous playwright was simply escaping hardship. The Germans apparently took his influence seriously enough to include him among prominent Britons marked for arrest if an invasion succeeded. There is something almost perfectly coward-like about his contribution. He did not need a false moustache or a hidden pistol. His cover was being exactly who everybody expected him to be, a celebrated entertainer who could appear at a party, charm a room, hear what important people were thinking, and leave without anyone imagining that the conversation itself might have strategic value. Number 13. Donald Crisp. By the time audiences knew Donald Crisp as one of Hollywood's great character actors, his face suggested dependable fathers, stern authority figures, and men who had already lived through several lifetimes. That impression was closer to reality than viewers realized. Crisp had been involved in filmmaking since the silent era, working as both actor and director and appearing in the orbit of pioneers such as D.W. Griffith. When the First World War arrived, however, his career was interrupted by military service. Biographical records connect Crisp with British Army intelligence during the conflict. The surviving public details are less colourful than the stories surrounding Sterling Hayden or Josephine Baker. There is no need to invent secret border crossings or coded nightclub meetings. The important fact is simpler. A man who would eventually become one of Hollywood's most recognizable supporting players had served in wartime intelligence before returning to the film business. Crisp's later career lasted for decades. He won an Academy Award for How Green Was My Valley and appeared alongside stars including Bette Davis, Errol Flynn, Clark Gable, Laurence Olivier, and Gregory Peck. That longevity almost erased the strangeness of his biography. Audiences saw a veteran actor who seemed born to play older men. They rarely knew that before sound pictures had even conquered Hollywood, Crisp had already stepped away from the movie world and into a military system where information mattered more than applause. Number 14. Dirk Bogarde. Elegant, controlled, and often emotionally unreadable, Dirk Bogarde became one of post-war British cinema's most fascinating leading men. His wartime experience helps explain why stories about intelligence followed him long after the fighting ended. Bogarde served in the British Army during the Second World War and became connected with intelligence work involving the interpretation of aerial photographs. Photo interpreters examined reconnaissance images for details that ordinary viewers could easily miss: defensive positions, transportation routes, industrial activity, construction changes, troop movements, or evidence that an enemy site had been damaged. The job demanded patience rather than glamour. A photograph could contain thousands of meaningless shapes and one strategically important detail. Analysts had to learn how shadows, scale, perspective, and repeated patterns could reveal what was happening on the ground. Bogarde later served closer to the fighting as Allied forces advanced through Europe, experiences that deeply affected him. Then, years after becoming a star, intelligence returned to his story from the opposite direction. British security files eventually revealed that officials had examined suspicions about possible Soviet interest in him. Nothing publicly released established that Bogarde became a Soviet agent. That makes his biography unusually ironic. During one war, he performed documented work connected with British military intelligence. During the Cold War, intelligence officials themselves looked at him with suspicion. The second story produced no proven spy career, but it demonstrates how easily celebrity, secrecy, and rumor could overlap. Number 15. Sarah Churchill. Being the daughter of Winston Churchill meant Sarah Churchill could never completely escape attention. Yet during the war, she took on a role where her famous surname mattered far less than her ability to sit for hours studying images of enemy territory. Before becoming known to American film audiences through appearances including Royal Wedding with Fred Astaire, Sarah served in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. She worked as a photographic interpreter in the intelligence system that analyzed aerial reconnaissance photographs. This was one of the less glamorous but most essential forms of wartime intelligence. Aircraft returned with thousands of pictures. Somebody then had to determine what those images actually meant. Analysts compared photographs from different dates, measured objects, examined railways and factories, searched for new defenses, and identified changes that might suggest an enemy operation was being prepared. A tiny shape on film could represent a gun position. An altered roof might indicate industrial activity. Fresh tracks could suggest movement that commanders needed to know about immediately. Sarah's service, therefore, placed her inside the quiet, analytical world behind major operations. She was not sneaking through occupied cities carrying coded papers, but intelligence does not function without people who can transform raw observation into usable knowledge. After the war, she returned to performance and appeared under studio lights. Few moviegoers watching her dance with Fred Astaire would have imagined that she had once spent her days examining photographs taken from military aircraft over hostile Europe. Number 16. Robert Preston. Robert Preston's later fame came from pure theatrical confidence. As Professor Harold Hill in The Music Man, he could overwhelm a room with speed, charm, and language. During the Second World War, however, communication had a far more serious purpose. Preston entered the United States Army Air Forces after already establishing himself in Hollywood. His wartime service included work as an intelligence officer connected with the 9th Air Force and bombardment operations in Europe. Air intelligence officers existed at the center of a constantly changing information cycle. Before missions, crews needed briefings on targets, enemy defenses, expected fighter activity, routes, weather, and previous attacks. After returning, airmen could be questioned about what they had seen, so intelligence staffs could update the picture for the next operation. That process lacked the glamour associated with fictional espionage, but it directly affected combat decisions. Bad intelligence might send crews towards stronger defenses than expected. Good intelligence could help commanders choose safer routes or understand whether an important target had actually been damaged. After the war, Preston returned to acting and eventually became unforgettable on Broadway and film. His ability to communicate quickly and convincingly became his signature. There is no reason to claim his stagecraft came from intelligence service. What can be said is that years before audiences applauded every rapid-fire sentence, Preston had worked in an organization where information also had to be absorbed, organized, and delivered clearly, except the people listening were preparing to fly into combat. Number 17. Douglas Kennedy. Douglas Kennedy never became one of the enormous marquee names of the Golden Era, but that may be exactly why his hidden wartime career is so easily overlooked. Before becoming a familiar face in westerns, crime films, and television, Kennedy served inside American wartime intelligence organizations. During the Second World War, he entered the military and worked with the Signal Corps, Army Intelligence, and the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was responsible for a remarkable range of activities, gathering intelligence, supporting resistance groups, conducting special operations, producing propaganda, and developing unconventional methods for fighting Axis forces. Kennedy's public biography does not provide a cinematic diary of every assignment, so it would be wrong to manufacture dramatic missions simply because the OSS name sounds exciting. What matters is that his service placed him directly within organizations handling sensitive wartime information and covert activity. He returned to Hollywood afterward and built the kind of career that depends on reliability rather than celebrity. Kennedy could appear as a lawman, officer, rancher, criminal, or authority figure, and immediately make the world of the film feel believable. That professional invisibility creates an interesting connection to intelligence work. A successful supporting actor helps a story without drawing too much attention away from the lead. A successful intelligence officer often prefers exactly the same thing: do the job, remain unremarkable, and allow somebody else to occupy the spotlight. Hollywood forgot most of Kennedy's Secret Service past because he never turned it into a personal legend. Number 18. Peter Ortiz. Few men on this list require less exaggeration than Peter Ortiz. His genuine biography already sounds like something a studio writer would be ordered to simplify, because audiences might not believe it. Ortiz had served in the French Foreign Legion before the United States entered the Second World War. After extraordinary experiences in North Africa and Europe, He became a Marine and eventually joined the Office of Strategic Services. His abilities in languages, military operations, and European conditions made him valuable for covert missions. Ortiz parachuted into occupied France, worked with local resistance networks, helped organize and support fighters, gathered information, and operated in territory where capture could mean disastrous consequences. His OSS service earned major decorations and placed him among the genuinely clandestine veterans who later entered the movie business. After the war, Hollywood somehow became his quieter career. He appeared in films associated with director John Ford, including Rio Grande, and often found himself in Western or military settings. He also worked as a technical advisor. The contrast could be almost comic. A director might ask him to look tougher in a scene, stand correctly with a weapon, or explain how a soldier should behave under pressure. Ortiz could follow the instruction without mentioning that he had already operated behind enemy lines with the resistance. Some performers spent their careers trying to look dangerous. Peter Ortiz had already completed the dangerous part before becoming an actor. Number 19. Horace Hahn. Horace Hahn began as a young performer, but the war redirected his life toward work that had almost nothing to do with ordinary Hollywood ambition. His path eventually moved from acting to the Office of Strategic Services and then into the legal aftermath of the conflict. Hahn joined the OSS during the Second World War. Accounts of his service connect him with operations in Central Europe, including a mission in Czechoslovakia near the closing stages of the war. Rather than remaining safely behind a desk, he became part of the organization's field structure at a time when front lines were collapsing and the political future of Europe was being decided rapidly. His intelligence experience later led into another unusual responsibility. Hahn participated in interrogations associated with the prosecution of major Nazi figures. That work demanded a different kind of observation. Instead of watching troop movements, investigators had to examine testimony, documents, personal histories, and attempts by defendants or witnesses to minimize responsibility. He eventually became a lawyer, and his acting career remained far less famous than those of the stars near the top of this list. Yet that is why Hahn matters here. Not every Hollywood performer who entered intelligence returned to become a household name. Some discovered that the war had permanently changed their direction. For Hahn, performing before a camera became only the opening chapter. The far more important scenes took place in secret operations and interrogation rooms where nobody was thinking about box office receipts. Number 20. George Ernest child actors are often remembered as symbols of innocence. But George Ernest reached adulthood during a period when Hollywood's young performers were being pulled directly into a world war. His own service eventually connected the skills of filmmaking with the work of the Office of Strategic Services. Ernest had appeared in numerous movies during the 1930s and early 1940s, including entries in the popular Jones Family series. When war interrupted his career, he entered military service and became associated with an OSS photographic unit. That connection made unusual sense. Modern intelligence depended heavily on images. Cameras could document terrain, record operations, collect evidence, assist training, and create visual material for planners. Film professionals already understood equipment, composition, exposure, editing, and the practical problems of getting usable footage under difficult conditions. Wartime photography, however, had none of the safety of a studio. A camera operator could not request better weather or ask everybody to repeat an action. Information had to be captured under whatever conditions existed. Some dramatic stories surrounding Ernest's wartime experiences are difficult to verify in detail, so the safest approach is to stay with the documented connection rather than decorating it with legends. His life still represents one of the strangest transformations in Golden Era Hollywood. A boy who had grown up performing in front of cameras eventually entered an organization where cameras could become intelligence tools. Hollywood used film to manufacture stories. The OSS used it to discover what was actually happening. Number 21. Robert Cornthwaite. Science fiction fans remember Robert Cornthwaite for The Thing from Another World, where he played Dr. Carrington, a scientist whose intense curiosity about an alien visitor puts him at odds with the military men around him. Long before that film gave him a career-defining role, Cornthwaite had already worked inside a wartime system where information had to be gathered, interpreted, and communicated under pressure. During the Second World War, he served with the United States Army Air Forces. Biographical accounts describe duties involving intelligence, communications, and broadcasting in the Mediterranean theater. Those responsibilities placed him within the enormous network that connected air crews, operational headquarters, commanders, and the constantly changing picture of enemy activity. Air warfare depended on more than aircraft. Every mission created information. Crews reported what they had seen. Ground stations tracked movements. Intelligence staffs compared reports and tried to understand where enemy forces were concentrating or how defenses were changing. Cornthwaite returned to acting after the war and became exactly the kind of performer Hollywood used whenever a scene required intelligence, seriousness, or academic authority. He played doctors, professors, scientists, officials, and men who seemed to be thinking several steps ahead. There is no need to turn his military service into a fantasy about hidden identities. The reality is interesting enough. Before Hollywood repeatedly placed him in rooms where fictional characters argued over evidence, Cornthwaite had already belonged to a wartime organization where evidence and communication could shape real operations. Number 22. Ross Hunter. Most people who know the name Ross Hunter remember the producer rather than the actor. He became famous for polished studio pictures such as Magnificent Obsession, Imitation of Life, Pillow Talk, and Airport. Before becoming one of Hollywood's great manufacturers of glossy entertainment, however, Hunter had a wartime chapter that biographies connect with military intelligence. Hunter served in the United States Army during the Second World War and worked in areas described as intelligence. Publicly available accounts do not provide the sort of mission-by-mission detail found in the records of an OSS field officer such as Sterling Hayden or Peter Ortiz. That distinction matters. There is no responsible reason to invent secret parachute drops, false passports, or coded meetings around a biography that does not support them. What can be said is that Hunter experienced a military environment where information was controlled, assessed, and passed through official channels before he later entered an industry built around controlling information of a very different kind. He knew how to package stars, manage publicity, shape public expectation, and give audiences exactly the emotional experience they had been promised. It would be too convenient to claim that wartime intelligence taught him how to produce movies. There is no evidence for such a straight line. Still, the contrast is irresistible. One part of his life involved information that had to remain restricted. The next involved images designed to be seen by millions. Number 23. Marius Goring. Marius Goring's greatest weapon during the war may have been something Hollywood often treated as a simple performance tool: his voice. Fluent in German and comfortable in European culture, Goring possessed exactly the linguistic ability wartime broadcasting organizations desperately needed. After entering British military service, he became involved with the BBC's German-language broadcasting and later served in positions connected with Allied headquarters. Radio aimed at German-speaking listeners formed part of a larger struggle over morale, credibility, and information. The objective was not merely to shout that the Allies would win. Propaganda worked best when the audience believed the broadcaster understood its fears, frustrations, and doubts. As Allied armies moved across Europe, language specialists and intelligence staffs became increasingly important. Reports had to be understood. Local information needed context. Enemy statements had to be interpreted, and broadcasts had to sound credible enough to survive the listener's suspicion. Goring later returned to acting and became internationally known for films including The Red Shoes. His refined screen presence made him seem perfectly at home in drawing rooms, theaters, and sophisticated conversations. During wartime, however, the same precision had served a much less romantic purpose. A performer's ability to control tone and communicate emotion had become part of an information campaign directed across enemy borders. He was not a conventional undercover spy, and calling him one without explanation would be misleading. But he belonged to the secretive information structure surrounding Allied warfare, where words and voices could be treated as strategic instruments. Number 24. Wilhelm von Brincken. One of the strangest stories on this entire list belongs to a man who really had been involved in espionage before Hollywood started hiring him to play suspicious Europeans. Wilhelm von Brincken came to the United States as a representative of Imperial Germany and became involved with German intelligence and sabotage activity during the First World War period. American authorities eventually arrested him, and he was convicted in cases related to German operations conducted on American soil. After prison, his life took an astonishing turn. He entered the film business. Hollywood in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s constantly required European officers, aristocrats, diplomats, and villains. Von Brincken's appearance and accent made him useful, and he built a career as a character actor. The studios rarely advertised the uncomfortable fact that the man portraying intrigue had once been tied to actual German espionage. The irony reached almost absurd levels when he appeared in movies dealing with foreign agents and wartime threats, including productions in which German officers or Nazi figures populated the story. A former intelligence operative was being paid to help Hollywood create fictional versions of the world he had once inhabited. Unlike many celebrity spy rumors, the basic outline here is not based on a glamorous post-war memoir. Von Brincken's arrest and German connection belong to the historical record. Hollywood spent fortunes trying to make spy stories feel authentic. Sometimes it unknowingly placed genuine experience directly in front of the camera. Number 25. Robert Montgomery. Robert Montgomery was already an established MGM leading man when the Second World War pulled him away from Hollywood. His polished image could have made him useful in safe publicity assignments, but his naval service eventually took him much closer to the operational world. Montgomery joined the United States Navy and served in roles that included work as an assistant naval attaché in London. Naval attachés operated in an environment where diplomacy, military liaison, information exchange, observation, and intelligence naturally overlapped. Later, Montgomery also served aboard small combat craft and participated in planning and operations connected with the European theatre. Popular accounts sometimes describe him simply as a naval intelligence officer. The more careful version is that his documented duties repeatedly placed him around organizations handling sensitive operational and military information rather than proving a glamorous undercover career. That distinction does not make his service ordinary. An attaché during wartime moved through exactly the kind of official networks where Allied governments exchanged information and coordinated their military efforts. Montgomery returned to Hollywood with substantial wartime experience and eventually directed as well as acted. His best-known experiments as a filmmaker included Lady in the Lake, shot largely from the detective protagonist's visual point of view. Perhaps that fascination with what a person can see and what remains outside the frame was simply artistic curiosity. Still, it suits a man whose war years had placed him inside a world where commanders constantly depended on incomplete pictures and needed people capable of filling in what could not yet be seen. Number 26. Madeleine Carroll. Few actresses could claim a stranger overlap between fictional and real wartime danger than Madeleine Carroll. Before the Second World War, Alfred Hitchcock had already cast the elegant British star in The 39 Steps and Secret Agent, films filled with pursuit, conspiracies, false identities, and international intrigue. Then Europe's real political crisis made those movie plots feel uncomfortably small. Carroll was one of the highest-paid actresses of her era, but personal tragedy pushed her away from ordinary stardom. Her sister was killed during a German air raid, and Carroll devoted increasing amounts of time to wartime service. She worked extensively with the Red Cross and used her language ability, fame, and international connections in support of the Allied effort. Biographical accounts also describe her acting as a liaison between American military personnel and elements of the French resistance. A liaison was not automatically a field spy. The role could involve communication, coordination, translation, movement between organizations, and the handling of sensitive relationships. That is why Carroll's story should not be exaggerated into a fictional secret agent career. The documented wartime work is impressive without decoration. Hollywood had once paid her to look frightened while running from fictional spies across Britain. A few years later, she was working in a Europe where occupation, bombing, resistance networks, and military secrecy were no longer plot devices. The difference was brutal. Hitchcock could end a dangerous scene whenever he wanted. History offered no director with that power. Number 27. Yul Brynner. Before Yul Brynner became instantly recognizable for a shaved head, commanding posture, and the role of the King of Siam, his most useful wartime quality was something audiences could not see at all. It was his ability to speak to people in their own language. Brynner came from an unusually international background and spoke multiple languages. During the Second World War, he worked in broadcasting connected with the United States Office of War Information. His French-language broadcasts were aimed toward listeners in occupied Europe, and accounts also connect him with other language services. The Office of War Information was not an espionage agency like the OSS, but it operated in a closely related battlefield: information. Governments understood that occupied populations needed news, encouragement, and reasons to distrust enemy propaganda. The voice delivering that message had to sound natural enough to be believed. Brynner therefore contributed as a broadcaster rather than a secret field operative. Yet his work demonstrates how the entertainment world fed directly into wartime psychological operations and public information campaigns. After the war, that same voice became one of his greatest acting tools. In The King and I, The Ten Commandments, and The Magnificent Seven, Brynner could dominate a scene before moving more than a few steps. Years earlier, unseen listeners across an ocean had encountered him in the opposite form. No face, no costume, no royal posture, only a voice, carrying information through a war zone. Number 28. Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith eventually became familiar to several generations as a respected dramatic actor, as the Penguin on television, and as Mickey training Rocky Balboa. During the war, however, his ability to perform was temporarily absorbed into America's military information system. Meredith entered the United States Army Air Forces and rose to captain. He later worked with the Office of War Information and appeared in government films made to educate personnel, explain wartime conditions, strengthen morale, and prepare servicemen for what they might encounter overseas. One example was A Welcome to Britain, which helped American troops understand cultural differences before operating alongside British civilians and forces. That may sound almost gentle compared with clandestine missions, yet military planners understood that misunderstanding an ally could create unnecessary conflict, while effective communication could make cooperation easier. Other films instructed personnel about specific duties or presented messages the government considered strategically useful. Meredith was therefore not a spy in the narrow definition. His work belongs to information warfare, the huge supporting structure that existed beside intelligence gathering. The same government fighting a secret war through the OSS also fought an open battle over what soldiers and civilians understood. Afterward, Meredith returned to a career built on extraordinary versatility. He could be comic, frightening, tragic, eccentric, or warm. During the war, those acting skills had briefly belonged to a different producer, the United States government, and the intended audience was preparing for something far more serious than a night at the movies. Number 29. Bruce Cabot. Bruce Cabot became famous as the rugged Jack Driscoll in the original King Kong, the man brave enough to pursue a giant creature for the woman he loves. His wartime service later added a real military chapter to an image Hollywood had already built around toughness. Cabot entered the United States Army Air Forces during the Second World War. His documented duties included service with the Air Transport Command in North Africa, where the movement of aircraft, personnel, equipment, and information was essential to Allied operations. Some biographical accounts also describe Cabot's overseas service as involving Army intelligence. Public details of that intelligence work are much thinner than those available for officers such as Henry Fonda, Robert Preston, or Sterling Hayden. For that reason, it would be misleading to tell viewers he spent the war undercover without stronger evidence. What can safely be said is that Cabot served as an officer in an operational theater where transport, planning, and intelligence functions constantly intersected, and multiple biographies attach intelligence duties to his record. After the war, he returned to movies and became a frequent member of John Wayne's supporting casts. Audiences saw him in westerns, war films, and adventures where danger was controlled by schedules and stunt coordinators. North Africa had offered none of those protections. Cabot's case is a useful reminder that historical storytelling becomes better, not weaker, when uncertainty is admitted. A reported intelligence connection does not need invented missions to remain interesting. Number 30. Hedy Lamarr. Few Hollywood images were more carefully manufactured than Hedy Lamarr's. MGM promoted her beauty so aggressively that audiences were encouraged to treat intelligence almost as an inconvenient detail. During the Second World War, Lamarr proved just how incomplete that image was. Working with composer George Antheil, she developed and patented a frequency-hopping communication concept intended to make radio-controlled torpedoes more difficult for an enemy to jam. The system proposed rapidly switching frequencies in a coordinated pattern so that a hostile listener or jammer could not easily interfere with the signal. The Navy did not immediately turn Lamarr's idea into the wartime weapon she imagined. Later spread-spectrum technology developed through the work of many additional engineers and should not be simplified into the popular claim that Lamarr single-handedly invented Wi-Fi. Still, the patent was real, technically serious, and motivated by a military communications problem. That makes Lamarr intelligence adjacent rather than an actual field spy. Secure communication sits at the heart of intelligence and modern warfare, and a Hollywood star was trying to solve one of its practical vulnerabilities, while studio publicity departments preferred discussing her appearance. The contrast became one of classic Hollywood's greatest ironies. Lamarr spent years being photographed as though her face were her only remarkable asset. Meanwhile, she was thinking about how a weapon could receive instructions without an enemy successfully blocking the message. Hollywood wanted beauty. The war briefly gave her a communications problem, and she attacked it like an inventor. Number 31. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier was already becoming one of the most important actors in the English-speaking world when the Second World War turned performance itself into a political weapon. His wartime story has sometimes been stretched into claims that he was a conventional secret agent. The better-supported reality is more subtle and reveals how closely propaganda, influence, cinema, and intelligence could overlap. While Olivier was working in the United States, Britain desperately needed American sympathy. Before Pearl Harbor, large sections of the American public wanted to stay outside the European conflict. British officials therefore supported efforts to explain their position, encourage aid, and influence powerful Americans, without making every activity look like an official government campaign. Olivier moved within film and social circles connected with producer Alexander Korda, whose relationship with British wartime authorities and intelligence has been widely discussed. Olivier and Vivien Leigh also appeared in That Hamilton Woman, a historical romance whose story of Britain resisting Napoleon carried an unmistakable contemporary message about standing against dictatorship. Olivier made broadcasts and supported patriotic cultural work, later returning to Britain and creating Henry V with government encouragement as a morale-building film. None of this proves that he slipped across borders under a false identity. Calling him a field spy would be inaccurate. His importance belongs instead to influence operations, where a world-famous performer could help shape how another country viewed Britain's struggle. That role suited Olivier in a strange way. Governments needed a persuasive national story, and they had access to perhaps the most persuasive actor of his generation. That usefulness came from a simple wartime reality. Celebrities could reach rooms ordinary officials could not. Olivier could speak with influential Americans as an artist rather than as a government representative, allowing a political message to travel through culture without always looking like official persuasion. Number 32. Leslie Howard. No Golden Era actor generated more persistent wartime spy theories than Leslie Howard. His death in 1943 transformed an already famous performer into the center of a mystery that historians still approach carefully. Howard was one of Britain's biggest international stars, remembered for The Scarlet Pimpernel, Pygmalion, and his role as Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind. Once war began, he devoted himself increasingly to British propaganda, broadcasting, filmmaking, and overseas appearances intended to strengthen support for the Allied cause. Then came his final journey. Howard boarded a civilian airliner traveling from Lisbon toward Britain. German aircraft attacked the plane over the Bay of Biscay, and everyone aboard was lost. Almost immediately, explanations multiplied. One theory claimed German intelligence believed Winston Churchill might be aboard. Another suggested Howard himself had been targeted because he was secretly carrying out intelligence work during his travels through Spain and Portugal. Some stories linked his meetings with influential figures to British covert efforts. The problem is proof. Howard's propaganda work is well established, but no surviving evidence conclusively demonstrates that he was a formal intelligence agent or that the aircraft was attacked specifically because of secret missions. That uncertainty should remain part of the story. A dramatic mystery becomes less honest when the question mark is removed simply to make a stronger headline. Leslie Howard unquestionably fought the information war. Whether he was also fighting a hidden intelligence war remains one of classic cinema's most famous unresolved claims. His final months also show why historians must resist turning coincidence into certainty. Lisbon was a center of wartime intrigue, crowded with diplomats, refugees, agents, and informants. Simply passing through that world made Howard interesting to intelligence services. But interesting is not the same as proven recruitment. Number 33. Walt Disney. Walt Disney was primarily a producer, animator, and studio chief rather than a conventional screen actor, although his own voice famously helped bring Mickey Mouse to life. His confidential relationship with the FBI nevertheless makes him impossible to ignore when discussing secret links between Golden-era Hollywood and government investigators. FBI files document a long association between Disney and the Bureau. During years when federal authorities were intensely concerned about communist influence in entertainment, Disney communicated with investigators and became a trusted contact. He also testified publicly before the House Committee on Un-American Activities and identified people he believed had communist connections. The relationship should not be exaggerated. Disney was not an FBI special agent in the normal law enforcement sense, did not possess ordinary investigative authority, and was not performing undercover missions through Hollywood sound stages. What he did possess was access. As the head of a powerful studio, Disney knew employees, unions, executives, political disputes, and industry personalities. That made information from him useful to federal officials trying to understand Hollywood's political networks. His studio also worked extensively for the government during the Second World War, producing training, educational, and propaganda films. Animation became another tool of mass wartime communication. Disney's story therefore shows how easily cultural power could become governmental value. A studio chief controlled images, seen by millions, employed thousands of people, and moved in influential circles. For investigators, a confidential relationship with someone like that could offer a window into an industry outsiders struggled to understand. The relationship also reflected the Bureau's fascination with motion pictures as both an industry and a tool of influence. Hollywood could shape public opinion on an enormous scale, so the political beliefs of people controlling studios naturally attracted attention from officials during the tense early Cold War. Number 34. John Ford. John Ford spent his civilian career making myths about soldiers, families, frontiers, courage, and American identity. During the Second World War, he temporarily turned his cameras away from fiction and placed them inside the machinery of intelligence and military documentation. Although remembered overwhelmingly as a director, Ford had also appeared as an actor during the silent era. By wartime, he was one of Hollywood's most respected filmmakers, and his visual skills were valuable to the government. He became associated with the Office of Strategic Services and led the Field Photographic Branch, which used trained film personnel for intelligence, documentation, training, and operational purposes. Ford's wartime work included filming during the Battle of Midway. The resulting documentary presented the battle to American audiences, but cameras in government service could have many purposes beyond public exhibition. Images could preserve evidence, assist analysis, train personnel, and record conditions more precisely than a written description. For a filmmaker, the transformation was profound. In Hollywood, Ford could control where actors stood, repeat scenes, change lenses, and wait for the light. Combat offered no second take, and no guarantee the cameraman would remain safe long enough to finish the shot. After the war, Ford returned to westerns and dramas and became one of cinema's most celebrated directors. Yet his wartime record reveals a secret marriage between Hollywood technique and intelligence work. the same skills used to construct an illusion on screen could also be used to capture reality when military planners desperately needed to see it. Ford's unit also reminds us that intelligence is often visual before it becomes verbal. A few seconds of usable film could show coastline, equipment, damage, or troop behavior more clearly than pages of description. For planners, the camera was not decoration, it was another instrument for collecting evidence. Number 35. Leo Genn. Leo Genn possessed the kind of educated authority that made casting directors reach naturally for him whenever a film needed a lawyer, officer, senator, or sophisticated professional. His real wartime background gave that screen presence an unusually serious foundation. Before his acting career fully matured, Genn had trained as a barrister. During the Second World War, he served in the British Army and eventually worked within the legal and investigative structure surrounding Allied headquarters. As the war ended, he became involved in investigations connected with suspected war crimes, and later assisted the prosecution process involving senior Nazi figures. This was not espionage in the classic sense. Genn was not pretending to be an enemy officer or stealing documents from a safe. His connection belongs to investigative intelligence, identifying people, examining evidence, interviewing witnesses, understanding records, and helping authorities construct an accurate account of events that had often been deliberately hidden. That job demanded skepticism. Defeated officials had powerful reasons to minimize their own responsibility. Documents could be incomplete. Witness memories could conflict. Investigators needed to separate provable facts from convenient stories. After the war, Genn returned to acting and earned an Academy Award nomination for Quo Vadis. His controlled speaking style made him one of the era's most dependable intellectual performers. Audiences may have assumed that authority came entirely from theatrical training. In reality, the actor had spent part of his life in a world where arguments were not written to entertain, and where establishing the truth could determine how history judged men accused of enormous crimes. That investigative background also gave Genn a life experience very different from the glamorous image normally attached to actors. He had confronted the aftermath of war through testimony and records before returning to costumes and sets, where every conflict could be safely resolved according to a finished screenplay. Number 36. Marjorie Stewart. Marjorie Stewart never achieved the lasting international fame of Marlene Dietrich or Cary Grant, which may be one reason her connection to Britain's secret war world receives so little attention. She worked as an actress, before wartime service redirected her life toward organizations operating far from the public eye. Biographical accounts associate Stewart with the Special Operations Executive, the organization created to support resistance, sabotage enemy systems, maintain clandestine communications, and conduct unconventional warfare in occupied territories. The SOE required far more than glamorous field agents. Behind every person parachuted into Europe stood networks of instructors, planners, communications staff, administrators, couriers, security personnel, and people who understood how to keep sensitive operations compartmentalized. The exact public detail surrounding Stewart's individual duties is limited, which means her story should not be expanded into invented missions simply because she was linked with a famous secret organization. Her personal life also connected her to the early British commando world through her marriage to Gustavus March Phillips, an officer associated with special operations. That world was dangerous enough that many of its participants did not return. Stewart's relative obscurity is actually useful when understanding real intelligence history. We remember celebrity agents because newspapers later found their stories irresistible. Thousands of other participants remained footnotes because secrecy and supporting work rarely produced glamorous biographies. Her acting career gave audiences a visible identity. Her wartime connection belonged to an organization built on exactly the opposite principle. The most successful work was often the work the public never saw. Because so much SOE material remained secret for years, later biographies often leave frustrating gaps. Those gaps should not be filled with invented adventures. In intelligence history, an absence of detail can itself be meaningful, especially when organizations were designed to reveal only what each participant needed to know. Number 37. Sonia Wigert. Sonia Wigert's wartime life contained the kind of double game that films often simplify, because the real version is too morally confusing. A celebrated Norwegian-born actress working in Scandinavian cinema, she found herself surrounded by German occupation, Swedish neutrality, intelligence services, and officials who wanted to use her fame for their own purposes. Wigert became involved with Swedish intelligence and was used in efforts to gather information from German contacts. Her celebrity created access. German officials could approach a famous actress socially without the meeting automatically looking like an intelligence encounter. Then, the situation became even more complicated. German intelligence also attempted to recruit or use her. That produced the dangerous appearance that Wigert was cooperating with the very system she was helping others monitor. In double-agent work, looking suspicious to outsiders can be part of maintaining credibility with the target. For years after the war, parts of the story remained unclear enough to damage her reputation. People could see contacts and rumors without knowing which side actually benefited from the information. Later archival research helped reveal more of her cooperation with Swedish intelligence. Wigert was not a major Hollywood contract star, but she belonged to the same international screen culture and became known across European cinema during the Golden Era. Her story may be one of the purest espionage examples on this list, because acting and intelligence genuinely became difficult to separate. She had to make people believe a role, while her real loyalties remained hidden. For once, the performance did not end when the cameras stopped. Her experience also demonstrates the personal cost of double work. A public figure depends on reputation, yet an operative may need to tolerate appearances that damage that reputation. Wigert could not simply explain every suspicious meeting while operations were active, because explaining the truth could destroy the value of the deception. Number 38. Jon Pertwee. Long before Jon Pertwee became famous as the Third Doctor in Doctor Who, wartime service placed him close to a secret world filled with the kind of strange devices later associated with fictional spies. Pertwee served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War and survived one extraordinary piece of timing when he was transferred away from HMS Hood before the battlecruiser was destroyed. His later service became connected, according to his own recollections and biographies, with the Naval Intelligence Division. Pertwee described secret equipment and clandestine support material that sounded almost too imaginative to be real. Concealed compasses, disguised escape aids, maps hidden inside ordinary objects, and devices designed for agents or personnel operating in dangerous territory. He also recalled connections with the intelligence environment in which Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond, served. Some of the most colorful details come from Pertwee's own later storytelling and are difficult to verify independently. That caution matters because celebrity memories often become more dramatic as anecdotes are repeated. The broader wartime connection, however, fits a fascinating pattern. Years before science fiction gave Pertwee gadgets, codes, monsters, and secret organizations, military service had introduced him to a world where unusual technology really was being developed for survival and clandestine work. He was not a golden-era Hollywood star in the narrow American studio sense, which is why he belongs near the bottom, but his generation, screen career, and intelligence association make him a striking example of how real Secret Service technology eventually fed the imagination of post-war entertainment. Pertwee's later screen persona made the story even more irresistible. His doctor was confident, technically minded, and surrounded by secret government organizations. Viewers could easily imagine that fiction growing directly from wartime experience, although any connection between the two should remain an interesting parallel rather than a claimed cause. Number 39. Michael Bentine. To Vantine, Michael Bentine built his reputation by making the absurd sound perfectly normal. As one of the original creative forces behind The Goon Show, he helped shape a surreal style of British comedy that influenced generations. Before that career, wartime service had placed him in a world where unusual information had to be treated with complete seriousness. Bentine served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, and biographies connect him with RAF intelligence. His multilingual and international family background gave him useful cultural knowledge, at a time when intelligence organizations depended heavily on people who could understand more than one language, recognize accents, and interpret the context behind enemy information. Exact descriptions of his duties vary, and Benteen later told wartime stories in the humorous style audiences expected from him. That means individual anecdotes should not automatically be treated as archival fact. Still, the intelligence connection adds a surprising layer to a man later associated almost entirely with comedy. Wartime intelligence was filled with jobs that looked boring from the outside, reviewing reports, listening to communications, comparing accounts, checking identities, and deciding whether a fragment of information meant anything. Yet the wrong interpretation could send resources in the wrong direction or cause officials to miss a threat. Benteen eventually spent his career turning misunderstanding into laughter. During the war, misunderstanding was exactly what intelligence personnel were trying to eliminate. Perhaps that contrast explains why his biography feels so unusual. The comedian who delighted in nonsense had once belonged to an organization where making sense of confusing information could be deadly serious. Benteen's case is another reason the title needs a broad definition. Military intelligence rarely looked like the cinema version of spying. Most personnel never used false names or secret weapons. Their value came from noticing patterns, understanding languages, checking reports, and delivering accurate conclusions to people making operational decisions. Number 40. Eddie Albert. The final name may surprise viewers who mainly remember Eddie Albert from Green Acres, Roman Holiday, or decades of genial character roles. Long before television turned him into a familiar comic presence, his life included reported intelligence gathering and unquestionably dangerous wartime service. Before the United States formally entered the Second World War, Albert traveled in Mexico. Several military and biographical accounts describe him quietly gathering information for American intelligence, including photographing or observing German activity around Mexican coastal areas. Some retellings become extremely dramatic, so specific claims about submarines and exact missions should be treated cautiously unless supported by records. What happened after America entered the war is much clearer. Albert joined the United States Coast Guard Reserve and served in the Pacific. During the Battle of Tarawa, he operated a landing craft and repeatedly helped rescue wounded Marines under extremely dangerous conditions. His courage later brought official recognition. That combination makes Albert a fitting final entry. He represents the blurred boundary running through the entire list. Some Hollywood people became formal intelligence officers. Some worked with the OSS or SOE. Some performed reconnaissance. Some became informants. Others participated in propaganda, deception, liaison, secure communications, or information gathering without ever fitting the movie definition of a spy. Albert eventually returned to entertainment and became famous for warmth and comedy rather than secrecy. That may be the greatest disguise of all. For viewers who knew only the friendly television actor, there was almost nothing in his later image to suggest that, before his most familiar roles, Eddie Albert had already lived through intelligence work, amphibious warfare, and one of the Pacific conflict's most brutal operations. He rarely turned these experiences into self-promotion, allowing the acting career to remain his identity. So which hidden Hollywood life surprised you most? Sterling Hayden in the OSS, Josephine Baker working with French intelligence, or Douglas Fairbanks Jr. helping create military deception? Tell us in the comments. These stars prove that golden-era Hollywood was sometimes stranger behind the camera than on the screen. If you enjoyed uncovering the truth behind these famous faces, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more forgotten Hollywood history.